Hello, and welcome to another episode of Real World Analytics, or What Schools Don't Teach You. This is another installment of my coffee series, where I find something interesting and want to give you my opinion in an informal fashion as a professional data scientist. Today I want to talk about PowerPoint. I'll put a copy of an article here. This was shared on LinkedIn by a friend of mine, Med. So thank you, Med, for sharing this. And it's about the fact that the CEO of Amazon has banned PowerPoint in his meetings. And what does he do instead? So if you'd like to hear what I think about this, and you'd like to get yourself a cup of coffee or some other beverage, if you hit the pause button, I'll wait for as long as you'd like. So let's go on about this. What's the point of this? How does Jeff conduct his meetings if he's not using PowerPoint? So if we scroll down a bit, you see that first of all what he does is everyone sits for 30 minutes and reads a story. So this has full sentences, subjects, verbs, etc. Now without going into PowerPoint, this would be a great advancement for my work and engagement with clients. This is independent of whether or not it's PowerPoint, however. So for example, if someone wanted to have a discussion with me or a meeting with me about how do I feel about using PowerPoint for data analysis, I would first send them to this video. And if I got to the meeting and they hadn't watched this video and they said, right, well, we haven't watched the video, just give me the highlights, what do you say? It's a bit off-putting when you spend all this work documenting and trying to be thorough with your opinions on something or the work you've done, and it hasn't been read before the meeting. So again, this doesn't have to do with PowerPoint, it has to do with meeting preparation in general, and whether or not people first want to spend the time to really engage with your results, your findings, and get to that foundation before the meeting begins and discussions happen. The next thing he points out is that our brains are wired for narrative. This I completely agree with. Stories are much better than bullet points, which is why I'm making these videos and trying to tell stories about my experience as a data analyst rather than just preparing some slides, for instance, and putting them online. So I completely agree. He goes on about the history of it. This is true even further in terms of oral histories and some other things like that. Now he says that, Jeff says that Jeff is a big fan of anecdotes in business, and he says that often customer anecdotes are more insightful than data. That is, we have an anecdote, that anecdotal evidence is more important than data, which I can't confirm or refute, but I do find it interesting that there's a bit of circularity there, that anecdotally anecdotes are better than data. So I don't think he means data though. I do think he means metrics, however, because they track different things. In fact, if I'm reporting some metrics and I want to talk about the mean, most people, especially if they haven't had much statistical training, might think of something like that. That's a normal distribution, most of the data are close to the mean, and that's fantastic. However, of course, if your distribution isn't normal, if it's heavy-tailed, if I told you the mean was 10, most people are thinking, okay, so the mean is 10, most things are going to be around 10. But they won't go on to think that, well, if the mean is 10, there still could be an outlier, and there could be values of 30, 100, more. But if the mean is 10 and there is a customer who, for whatever reason, thinks they should have been waiting 10 days and has been waiting a month, they're the one that are going to call you. So I don't think that anecdotes and metrics being in conflict is surprising. If your metric was instead not what the mean is, but what is the longest a customer's been waiting. And if the mean is 10, but there is a customer who has been waiting 30 days, that 30 is in some ways more illustrative than the fact that the mean is 10. It goes on to say that Amazon uses a ton of metrics. So I'm not a fan of using a ton of metrics. I use 5 or 6. To me, that's enough. Maybe there are different 5 or 6 for each division, but 5 or 6 is plenty in terms of getting an overall summary of how things are going, which is why I would use metrics. And going further with the metrics, says Jeff has something else to say, that it's important to check with your data with your intuition and instincts, and you need to teach that to executives and junior executives. This is the real highlight of this article to me, and the thing that I want to stress, because in my experience, there's 4 loose cases that I have, going from kind of least common to most common. The least common is you find an insight in the data, you present that to the client, and they say, yeah, we know that. Now that's not the least common because you'd find things in the data that the customer already knows. You do that all the time. But when you start a new contract, you start a new engagement, the first thing you should check is, well, what does the customer already know? And that should guide you in terms of not presenting that information. So it happens rarely, but it does still happen because sometimes people throw data over the fence and say, here, tell me something. And you tell them something, and it might be the obvious something, and they say, yeah, we know. So that does happen. The next one down is they say something like, well, we thought that was the case, but it's good that you've confirmed it. Or, we knew that was the case, but you've been able to quantify it for us. Thank you. So this happens in terms of certain customers being riskier or more or less profitable than others. That they have anecdotal evidence, but maybe you're able to quantify it, or you're able to confirm the anecdotes. That happens sometimes, and it does feel nice, it does still add value, but it's not as good as perhaps it could be. The next one down is you give them something, and this is what I consider to be the general insight, that they give you data, you tell them something about the data, and they say, we hadn't known that. And now that you say it, okay, it makes sense. And kind of surprised we didn't know that before, but thank you, that's really good. And that's really nice as a data science professional. When you get data, you do some analysis on the data, and you're able to provide genuine value to the customer. That's kind of what I live for. Unfortunately, that's less common than the last one, which is you deliver some insight, and they say, nah, we disagree. We don't think that's the case. You must have done something wrong. And this is where the real work occurs, in my opinion, because you've got the data, you've done your analysis on the data. As part of your analysis on the data, you probably agree that the data aren't perfect, and now you disagree with the customer about whether or not that's real. If your customer is non-technical, it's an uphill battle to try to discuss all the complicated data analysis you're doing, and you have this kind of paradox because it's complicated data analysis that they can't do. That's why they've hired you, but then you can't really explain to them what you've done because they don't understand it, and you need to mediate this conflict, right? You need to clear this up one way or the other, and either try to convince them that the data are telling them this, and what they do with that knowledge is up to them, or that perhaps the way you've cleaned the data has taken out some key points, some key, how should I put this? Some key information in the data you've cleaned out, and that is the cause between your data disagreeing with their instincts. And then there's the final point that the author makes here, that bullet points are the least effective ways of sharing ideas. I don't disagree, but I think this is a little unfair. So for example, now when I'm preparing this, I have bullet points. If I were to just hand you these bullet points, it wouldn't make much sense to you, perhaps. Bullet points, I only use them as a way to guide my thoughts, to organize my thoughts. And if I were to just give you those 6 bullet points, rather than this accompanying video, you struggle to understand what I was on about. So I don't disagree with them that bullet points aren't effective ways to share ideas, but when I'm using bullet points, especially in PowerPoint, that's not meant to be the sum total of my documentation. That's not meant to be my full message, but rather to help guide me in terms of organizing my thoughts and what I want to discuss. So those are my thoughts about PowerPoint kind of generally, bullet points more specifically. And I have a lot more thoughts on this that don't come from this article. I'm making that in another video. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video. But what do you think? What do you think about using PowerPoints in terms of data analysis? Do you use PowerPoints with bullet points? Do you use PowerPoints with graphs, maps, etc.? Or do you try to avoid it at all costs? Thank you for watching.